Does your country need a Putin? More and more people across America, Germany, Britain, France, and really all around the world are beginning to sympathize with the Russian dictator. And it's easy to see why. You look at America's leadership, where they're deliberately dismantling the nation's power. Who wouldn't want a leader that stands up for his people? LGBT policies all around the world are ripping apart families and even mutilating children. But Vladimir Putin makes a big deal about standing up for family values and standing up to the woke agenda. Churches are being increasingly persecuted in the West, but Vladimir Putin encourages religion and church attendance, and he really works hard to present himself as a man of faith. We had Jeremiah Jacques on the show last week where we looked at Vladimir Putin's role in Bible prophecy. We've got him back today, joined by Mihailo Zekig. The two are working on an article for our next Trumpet print edition on exactly this issue. So, Jeremiah, if we start with you, is Putin the answer?
Well, if you listen to Putin, then the answer to that is yes. During a speech in February, he said, quote, "Everything we do is somehow connected to supporting the family," end quote. So these kinds of statements have become very common from Russian President Vladimir Putin. He says this kind of thing quite often because he wants to convince Russia and the world that Russia is an upright nation and that it's the last champion of family values. He wants to convince everyone that the West has never treated Russia fairly and that Russia should be allowed to absorb the nations around it, such as Georgia and Ukraine, largely to protect them from American evil and decadence. And he wants to convince them that Russia is a victim and America is the chief villain whose main goal is to destroy Russia, and that it uses Ukraine as kind of a pawn toward that end. So that's Putin's basic message. And within Russia, the majority of people see it the way he does. They agree with him. That's partly because he's been in power now for 24 years, and he has rewritten history books. He has mandated school curricula, and he has suppressed the press to a really stunning degree. So that's a pretty easy thing to do inside of Russia when you're increasingly dictatorial. But reaching hearts and minds outside of Russia isn't as easy. So for this, Putin actually invests billions of dollars each year into mass media and social media. In 2021, more than $1.5 billion worth went toward these efforts. And then the next year, that amount tripled.
Do you happen to know how much America and the CIA spends on that kind of outreach? Like Voice of America?
I would imagine it's comparable to these Russian levels. It may be around there. But we, of course, have thriving alternative press as well, and lots of press that is not state mandated. In Russia, that's becoming quite rare to have anything that doesn't have the thumb of the Putin regime kind of pressing the scales. But yeah, they spend a great deal of this. The bulk of it goes to official state media outlets such as Sputnik, Rossiya, Sagodnia, TASS, and RT. RT is really the biggest one. They were called Russia Today until a few years ago when they rebranded just to avoid scaring people away from their propaganda. They thought it would sound a little, a little less conspicuous to be called RT instead of Russia Today. And RT alone is available to 700 million TV viewers in over 100 countries. And that includes 85 million viewers in the United States. And its website states that RT consistently and significantly outperforms other foreign channels, including Euronews and Fox News. So quite an impressive reach there. And of course, it's also online with an almost ubiquitous presence online. Back in 2013, RT actually became the first television news channel on YouTube to hit 1 billion views. So that's quite an impressive accomplishment. And it's all used to get that basic Russian message out there. Russia is a victim. America is the bad guy. Russia is good. And Russia is a noble defender of all that is good. And Russia is anything but an imperialist aggressor. And of course, Putin also pays some Western politicians to parrot the Kremlin's talking points, and he keeps both professional and amateur journalists in other nations on his payroll for the same purpose. He employs thousands of full-time internet trolls working inside of Russia. They work in shifts around the clock on platforms such as Facebook, Reddit, X, TikTok, YouTube, and even Tinder. These individuals often pose as conservative Americans, and they leave endless posts and comments highly critical of America and Britain and Israel, and championing all things Russian. And of course, Putin's regime also taps into the power of automation, using hundreds of thousands of bots to extend the shadow of these trolls. And it all pays off a great deal. You can look at some of the conservative talking points in European, in the right wings of Europe and in the right wings of the US, and you see that these efforts pay dividends.
I think it's interesting to stop here and look like, I asked about America because Russia is very good at having well, I'm doing the same thing as what you're doing message. There's no difference here. So you look at the United States, and the United States has Voice of America News. Britain has the BBC. We have state media. And we have outreach programs, and we have funds that go to foreign politicians and money to pay them to parrot specific lines. We have state employees that work to shape the discussion on social media. It's done maybe a little bit differently from Russia because it's American companies that own Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all of these different media outlets. So if anything, the American government has more control there. They don't have to kind of resort to troll farms. They can call Mark Zuckerberg. So I think this kind of Russia can very plausibly say, look, we're doing the same thing as America. And I think that's where there's two aspects of it. One is America, I think, is becoming more and more evil. And like you're looking at, okay, well, you used to stand up here and be able to say, yes, well, Vladimir Putin imprisons journalists and America doesn't. Steve Bannon's in jail right now. Does that apply anymore? So I think the radical left regime in America is moving in the direction of Putin's Russia. The other part of this, though, is two wrongs don't make a right. And the fact that the American government is moving in the direction of these kind of communist Putin-esque tactics doesn't mean that it's right when Putin does it. And I think even Steve Bannon, they are starting to go out of media. Vladimir Putin's killed journalists, right? You probably have some of the background on how many that he's killed. There is a pretty fundamental difference, even still, in terms of press freedom and some of these values that are coming from Russia.
It's true. In Trumpet editor-in-chief Gerald Fleury's booklet about Vladimir Putin, this booklet is called The Prophesied Prince of Russia. And in that one, he cites a statistic, 130 journalists that it's very easy to see that Putin has had them executed. And this was, I believe, a 2017 statistic. So it's likely to be considerably higher now. And you're exactly right. I don't think there's a nation on earth that is guiltless of these kinds of efforts. Propaganda is ubiquitous. Psychological warfare has been around as long as man has been around, I would say. But the Russians also want you to think that. They often revert to what you could call whataboutism. As soon as you say, Putin, you've killed 130 journalists, his propagandists will say, what about Bannon? He'll very quickly deflect attention. So I think it's great that you pointed out two wrongs don't make a right. Of course, the U.S. is not guiltless. Neither is Britain. Neither is any nation. But in Russia, we see this happening on a scale that I believe is perhaps not totally unmatched anywhere else. I'm thinking of nations like China, but it is in a different ecosystem than what we see here in the U.S.
I think the U.S. mainstream media is very complicit in Putin's success. It's ironic because they're the biggest ones. They will attack Putin. They'll point the finger at Putin and they'll condemn people on the right for supporting Putin. But I think they're the ones that have dragged Western media's credibility through the mud with their repeated lies, with their repeated refusal to cover certain issues. if the Western media was honest, Russia Today wouldn't have a leg to stand on. They wouldn't have that 1 billion views, a target that we're still quite some ways from, but hopefully we'll hit someday with Trumpet World. But they're able to draw a lot of views because people know that the mainstream is lying to them. And so they're looking for alternatives. And when you've got a warped measuring stick, like they know, okay, we can't use the measuring stick of mainstream media. That is wrong. What do they believe anymore? And so I think Russia Today is only able to really present themselves as plausible because of that. So, yeah, there's a lot of guilt, I think, to the left-wing media that cry the most about this.
It's a very good point. Faith in institutions such as, mainstream media and our political caste was already declining over the last decade or so. But then came COVID. And I think that the way the elites handled that really squandered almost all remaining credibility that a lot of these institutions had. And so you had nearly a total erosion of trust in a lot of the established institutions there. And so many people started to turn to fringe media sources. And a lot of these are directly paid for by Putin's regime. So there's not a great alternative out there, I think, unless you want to maybe turn to our publications.
1 billion views, here we come. Okay, looking at all of the Russian PR industry is one part of this, but then also the image that the Russian PR industry is presenting is another important part of this subject. So a big part of this image is that Russia is the bastion of Western values. America has rejected Western values. America, the US State Department is using its money and influence to promote pride parades and adults that will put on completely inappropriate displays in front of children. Like, if you want to keep your children pure and if you want to keep normal, intact families with a husband and a wife, Russia says, well, we're the champion of that. They've put a lot of money into getting that message out there. What is the reality?
Yeah, the reality is very dark. It's very disturbing. And of course, you're right that the perversion in America and in other Western nations, it's pervasive and it's unquestionably destructive. And Russia does have some laws, some anti-LGBT activism laws. They have laws banning propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations among minors. And these are sound measures. And some right-leaning Westerners portray these as somewhat unique. Some say that these things make Moscow kind of a moral compass for the world. But the truth is, laws like those are common and vigorously upheld throughout Africa, the Middle East, much of Asia. And Russian society, like those in Africa and the Middle East and much of Asia, is not morally upright by any means. It's just that it has a different brand of godlessness than the West has. Exhibit A is Russia's abortion rate. In 2017, Russia legally aborted 480 babies for every 1,000 live births. That figure, 480 abortions for Russia, that's more than double the US's rate of 200 and more than triple Germany's 135. And this culture of rampant abortion is a big part of why Russia has one of the world's lowest fertility rates, hovering right now around 1.4 births per woman, which is far below the 2.1 that you need just to keep the population from collapsing. And then if you look at the Russians who do bring children into the world, many of them abandon those children to the world. In 2011, Russia admitted at the United Nations that it had more than 650,000 children who were registered orphans, and 90% of those were what is called social orphans, meaning at least one of their parents is alive. And most of those orphans languish in a state care system that is notorious for cruelty and neglect, and almost 2 million Russian children each year are reported to be abused. Also notable is that Russia is one of just a handful of countries where possession of child sexual abuse material is not illegal. So that's an extremely dark crime that they've chosen not to ban. And then moving on to women, Russia is also profoundly misogynistic. Rates of domestic violence on women are in the stratosphere, partly because of the teachings of the Russian Orthodox Church. The church leaders actually think that domestic violence is essentially part of Russian traditional family. And in 2017, Russia decriminalized battery offenses against family members. So that signaled open season for wife beaters. 1 in 5 Russian women suffer domestic violence, and some 8,500 of them each year die from that. So this means 10% of all women around the world who die by the hand of a partner are Russian, even though Russia only makes up about 1.8% of the global population. So those rates are just stratospheric. And the culture of misogyny and violence is part of the reason why Russia has the world's 4th highest rate of divorce. This rate is 60% higher than that in the United States. And then in a related trend, Russia's rates of alcoholism and drug addiction are just off the charts. This is part of the reason why the life expectancy of a 15-year-old Russian male is the same as that of a 15-year-old male from Haiti. Both of those boys, on average, will only live to be 53.7 years old. So just really abysmal life expectancy, largely because of alcoholism and addiction. But the rates of addiction are beginning to fall now, since the Putin regime has been sending a lot of its addicts to Ukraine to kill and be killed. Another very tragic fact here is that Russian military culture is built on a utterly psychotic policy called Dedovchina. This translates to reign of the old timers, and it basically allows men who have been in the forces longer to brutalize new recruits in a whole range of ways, including beatings, sexual torture, and rape. The abuse is so widespread that hundreds of young men in the military die of it each year, and hundreds more die of suicide related to this. In 2019, the Russian military prosecutor office admitted that Dedovchina was getting worse, with 51,000 human rights violations documented that year. And then on the topic of military matters, this war that family-friendly Russia is waging against Ukraine has shattered hundreds of thousands of families in both Ukraine and Russia. You know, think of all the parents mourning sons, all the children mourning fathers. And according to Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, 700,000 Ukrainian children have now been deported to Russia since the war began. Many of these children have at least one living parent or grandparent back in Ukraine, but Putin's regime abducts them just the same, partly as a means of slowing down Russia's demographic collapse. So you put all this together and you see that Russia is absolutely not a bastion of family values or a defender of traditional values. And those who portray it as such should know better. They should know much better.
Wow, these are some pretty shocking statistics. I mean, this might be more of Mihailo's area of study, I think, while you were at university. It reminds me a bit of the Nazis, 1930s. Like there's a big message of family values going out there in reaction to all the perversion around them. Meanwhile, you've got people like Ernst Röhm right at the top of the Nazi movement that are homosexual. I mean, is that kind of thing going on in Russia? Like, obviously, we know Vladimir Putin. I think there's all kinds of speculation, or it seems that he left his wife for some gymnast. I mean, is that just even in the personal morality of those at the top of Russia? Do we have any knowledge of what kind of things going on there?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, the gymnast, that would be Alina Kabeva, rumored to be Vladimir Putin's wife. They were first photographed together when she was 18. I think it was 2001. And that's, again, like the first evidence that they've known each other. There's rumors that she's even given birth to 2 of his children in Switzerland since then. The memory serves me right, I think Putin's 71 and she's 41 now. So some bit of perspective there.
That's part of the issue. We don't have a lot of information about his inner circle and things like that. But I think for the purposes of this article, Mihailo, you were focusing more on this religious image, that there is real hostility to churches, to Christian groups in the West. I mean, we've seen the IRS kind of go after religious organizations in the United States. Vladimir Putin presents himself as a country that is friendly to Christianity, that supports, that believes that's a strong pillar of any successful nation. What's the reality there?
Well, as you mentioned, they do a lot of portraying that this is like a religious paradise, and a lot of those talking points that we mentioned about, like, standing up to homosexuals and that kind of thing, that feeds into that. Even when the Church of England decided to, I believe it was to recognize same-sex marriage, Putin actually came out and gave a statement on that, like showing how, I guess, his portrayal of it. Again, and if you listen to Putin's propaganda, you'll think that everybody's going to Sunday services at their local church or cathedral, that everybody's devoutly following the teachings of the Bible, though some of those statistics Jeremiah brought in show that's not the case. But even in regards to religious observance, statistics suggest only about 9% of Russians regularly attend religious services, and that's even including Muslims and some other minorities in there. And for a lot of people, even with those statistics, looking at what Putin is doing, some may think that, okay, maybe there is a bit of a caveat to some of his religiosity. But at the same time, they're doing all these things, and you compare what the West's doing, you compare what Ukraine's doing with the Russian Orthodox Church there, that Putin is still really the good guy of this.
But let's talk about what this really is, Steve. This is a war on Christianity. The Ukrainian government is attacking Christians. The Ukrainian government is executing priests. Russia is not doing that. They're not attacking Christianity. As a matter of fact, they seem to be protecting it. So that's something else that's clear and obvious to many people that are looking closely at what's going on.
That was U.S. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene actually speaking to Steve Bannon's podcast back in April. And if you continue on listening to what she had to say, she basically made a comparison that just how Ukraine is attacking Christianity and Russia's defending it, that's the same battle we're facing in the United States, that Russia is one of our allies in fighting against godlessness and going to support religious freedom. Of course, the Russian Orthodox Church has a huge presence in Russia and has had for hundreds of years. But for a lot of those same religions that maybe some people in the West belong to, that are thinking that Putin is part of the movement to help them, those same religions are banned in Russia in one way or another. Russia, like many other countries, has laws against religious extremism that they use to shut down organizations like some legitimately dangerous cults and Islamic radical groups and whatever. But among those religions listed in there are Jehovah's Witnesses. If you are a Jehovah's Witness in Russia, you belong to an illegal group and you could go to prison. The same thing, it's not necessarily Christian, but Falun Gong, the persecuted Chinese group that owns Epoch Times. That group is persecuted in Russia, not as severely as they are in China, but you could still end up in jail if you belong to Falun Gong. Some other groups that maybe don't have as severe persecution, but still get a lot of pressure from Russia include Pentecostals and Baptists. A lot of people in Russia view those as like American imports, and that's part of the American culture they're trying to purge out. In Russia, they have laws that if you're not in one of the officially recognized religions, you cannot preach in public. You cannot, even talking about your religion to non-believers can count as that. And a lot of Pentecostal and Baptist groups have had their organizations shut down or been fined money to basically shut up, because there's one Baptist minister, I believe he was in St. Petersburg, he got his building confiscated from him because he violated this law by supposedly putting his Sunday worship times on a sign outside of his building. Like, that counted as illegal proselytization in Russia. And again, going to other religious groups, I mentioned Falun Gong. Another one that obviously has a lot of pressure from Russia is Judaism. Putin, for his credit, probably has treated Jews a lot better than, like, say, the Soviet authorities or even the Tsars had. He's trying to make links, say, with the Russian diaspora in Israel and whatever. But even in 2004, I believe, there were 20 members of the Duma, Russia's parliament, that actually put in a motion to ban all secular and religious Jewish institutions in Russia. And talk about, people talk about how Russia's standing up against Nazism. Again, another Kremlin talking point. Banning Judaism, like, at least that there's enough people, influential people in the government to even make that suggestion. I think that says a lot about what Russia views about religious freedom, what Russia views about, again, fighting for Christianity. And that, again, goes to what Jeremiah was mentioning. In some Orthodox theology, the secular ruler is considered superior to the spiritual ruler. If you go to the cathedral in Bulgaria, for example, they have two thrones there. And the throne for the Tsar, which they used to have, is bigger purposely than the one of the Patriarch over there, because the Tsar, Caesar, if you will, has bigger superiority over God. And that top-heavy secular influence in religion, that is a hallmark of what the kind of tradition Putin and his regime are trying to bring.
It's important to understand Satan is the god of this world. The Bible tells us that in 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 4. It tells us that there's a lot of people out there who are sincere. There's a lot of even Christian teachers out there who are sincere, but they're deceived. And they're not preaching what the Bible preaches. That's the case all over the world. That's not just the case in Russia. That's the case everywhere. What you do have, though, is that's unique in Russia is what you pointed to at the end, where I think it's pretty much, if not quite official, maybe say open, somewhere between an open secret and being official, that the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, the kind of the metropolitan, is just about, he's always a KGB agent.
Not only him, but his predecessor as well, the last two patriarchs. And if you think about it, say in American terms, imagine if Bill Burns or Jake Sullivan all of a sudden became the head of the Episcopalian Church in the United States. That would raise a few eyebrows. But in Russian society, that's not necessarily considered taboo or a problem.
Russia promotes Christianity because in Russia, Christianity largely means the Russian Orthodox Church, and the Russian Orthodox Church is a tool of the Russian state. So there's a pretty overt self-interest in the government promoting religion over in Russia.
And the religion promoting the government.
Right. It goes both ways, an important point. So I think that's important to understand. I think that's important to understand even with the religious dimension of the conflict around Ukraine, where the Russian Orthodox Church within Ukraine is a tool of the Russian state, and the Ukrainian government have an interesting problem in working out how to deal with that. It's led to religious splits.
Well, it's not even just that, but as Russia's been going into Ukraine, they've been doing a lot more of these kinds of things that I've been telling to you on a much grander scale than even what they're doing at home. The independent Russian news medium Vertska in 2023 documented 109, quote, acts of pressure on churches and religious figures against 5 religious denominations, end quote, in Ukraine. And in at least 66 of these cases, they said that church buildings, mosques, and other religious centers and organizations were taken over by the Russian military. A lot of their property confiscated, some of them looted and destroyed, and some of them, the military has actually converted to military warehouses, police departments, and even offices of United Russia, which is like the political party that Putin is affiliated with. So they're literally taking religious buildings, again, across different denominations, including the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, various Protestant groups. And in some cases, these are turning into the equivalent of like the Democratic Party offices in Ukraine.
So again, that fleshes out the picture for us. It's a lot more detailed, a lot more nuanced. There's a lot more disturbing things going over below the surface than the image Russia likes to present to the world. But I think, Jeremiah, you had a bit more that you put together for this article on just exactly what type of man we're dealing with in Vladimir Putin.
There is a quote that I'd like to share about that. This is from the cover story of our March 2017 print edition of the Philadelphia Trumpet. This was an article by editor-in-chief Gerald Flurry, and he wrote, "Putin is not just an authoritarian leader. This is a man with beastly power and a beastly desire to rule the world. He is a vengeful, monstrous friend of the devil with all sorts of anti-God policies. He is steeped in secrecy, deception, manipulation, aggression, intimidation, coercion, and force. And there is far more about him that we do not know." So I think that's just an extremely, condemning assessment of Russian President Vladimir Putin. That quote alone should help people to say, maybe I shouldn't be taken in by this propaganda saying this is the man who's going to save Judeo-Christian values around the globe.
And again, I don't really blame people for looking at this and kind of saying, well, yeah, we need a Vladimir Putin. We need a guy like that. And for distrusting what they're hearing from the mainstream media. Like we're in this situation where we've had 8 years of the mainstream media saying Donald Trump is Hitler. So if they've been saying that for 8 years, like, of course, when they come out and say Vladimir Putin is a bad guy, like, yeah, question that. Don't take for granted that what the mainstream media is telling you, this guy is evil, that guy is evil. I mean, it's so obvious that Donald Trump isn't Hitler that, of course, then that's led to a whole lot of people saying, well, maybe I should reevaluate who is good and who is evil and who are the good guys and the bad guys, if that is what I'm being told. And so I think really so much of the blame for this lies with the mainstream media. But it is then, because the mainstream media isn't doing their work, we need to do ours. And we need to not take the Russian media output, the Russian media machine at face value, in the same way that we don't take the mainstream media in the West at the face value. We don't take the New York Times and CNN at face value, because we know and we've seen them lie about so many things. So we also need to not take Russia Today and various different English language outlets that kind of have links back to them. We don't take them at face value either, because we know that there's an agenda there too. And I think if you look at the type of man Vladimir Putin is, and you bring it back to, well, what is his character? What has he done? And you look at that and you do see a deeply evil individual. Someone like Jeremiah said, who's not afraid to take rid of, move 700,000, nearly 1 million Ukrainian children, mass kidnapping on an epic scale. I mean, that is evil. This is a man who will murder journalists to stay in power, who will do whatever it takes, kill however many people to dominate his politics. This is someone who, you see people looking at Israel and saying, well, what Israel is doing in Gaza is horrific. They're killing way too many people. They're committing genocide. And while they're doing this, they will share pictures of Aleppo or Grozny, areas that Vladimir Putin flattened, because they're actually much more destroyed than Gaza ever was. And that's the kind of fake news that spreads around there. And you look at the statistics from some of those places and you see actually Israel's working pretty hard to preserve civilian life. And it was Vladimir Putin who will just come in and flatten. Grozny in Chechnya was really, really obliterated. Aleppo in Syria from Putin's backed Bashar al-Assad. Like, he is not afraid of civilian casualties on a massive scale. And those people that will point the finger at Israel will not point the finger so readily at Vladimir Putin. So we need to understand who we're dealing with, and we do have a responsibility to be credulous, to get the facts behind the output coming from this Kremlin media industry.
Yes, another talking point. I'm glad you mentioned like some of those, like Grozny and Aleppo and whatnot, because a common talking point that some of his defenders in right-wing media will say is that, well, the situation in Ukraine is complicated. There's a lot of Russian speakers there that see themselves as being Russian. Putin's just sorting out a mess that was left unsettled since 1991. He doesn't want to continue on further. He's not going to threaten the world. In Miss Green's case, she said he's never said that he's going to invade like Western Europe or that kind of thing. Like he would, because that would give up the whole game. But at the same time, like Mr. Fleury in that quote Jeremiah mentioned, like he said he wants to rule the world. That's not hyperbolic. And even without the perspective we have, you could definitely see a lot of things Putin has said, a lot of things Putin has done that suggests that he has some kind of ambition like that. A common quote that people repeat is a speech where he, I believe it was in 2004, when he said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. I mean, when you look at how far the Soviet Union was and look at what the kind of things they were doing, like to see that as a catastrophe, for that to go away, that says a lot.
That's a really important point. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned. Like, Stalin is the second biggest mass murderer in history, more than Adolf Hitler. So I think we aren't horrified by communism the way that we might have been 60, 70 years ago, but that is a statement that should horrify us.
Yeah, and it's not an isolated one. When he was in the early 1990s, when he was in the mayoral office in St. Petersburg, he attended a conference hosted by some Estonian diplomats, I believe, which of course recently just broke away from the USSR, a tiny country on the Baltic, doesn't really have much in and of itself to defend itself. And the Estonian figure was speaking about all the evils that happened when Stalin came and annexed Estonia, and Putin was so mad he just got up and walked out of the meeting. This is something that is deep in his psyche. And as regards, if you talk about the rest of Europe, a few years ago, there was even apparently pretty credible allegations that some of his intelligence apparatus were forming unrest in Spain, this Catalonia, the perennial breakaway region, that there was even talks of Russian mercenaries popping up to secure Catalonia's independence if anything happened. And when Putin was questioned on that, his response was, well, it wasn't too long ago when people were cheering countries in Europe breaking up like Czechoslovakia or the Soviet Union. I mean, he's not going to stop at the Dnieper River. He has global ambitions. There's a famous quote that Stalin made at the Potsdam conference that I think definitely applies to Putin. An American diplomat came up to him after World War II was completed in Europe, and he said, "You must be feeling pretty good about yourself. Your boys made it all the way to Berlin." And Stalin just wouldn't even smile and looked at him and said, "Well, Tsar Alexander made it all the way to Paris." Like, that kind of thinking, you could see that in Putin's foreign policy. And the more we think he's not doing that, the more he can get away with stuff like in Ukraine, like in Georgia, like in Spain even.
I mean, it does get back to this point of the other side being bad doesn't make him good. I mean, the other big thing that he's alluding to with his comments with Catalonia, I think quite openly, are Kosovo and the breakup of Yugoslavia. And he does have a point. Like, that the West just came in, broke up a country and cheered it and did this out of all kind of regard for what diplomatic norms and international law would normally be applied to Europe. So there are legitimate things. I think you look at, say, Ukraine. Are there big questions about why the Biden administration is sending so much money to Ukraine? And again, I know the amount of money gets exaggerated. Like, yeah, I have questions. I wonder if we've seen all that they're doing there. And this is a question that has just been thrown into even sharper relief with the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. But having those questions doesn't make Vladimir Putin the good guy, and doesn't make him mean that he's fighting for some kind of liberation in Ukraine. And in fact, you look at the circumstances around the invasion and everything that you've said about him and this ultimate agenda to resurrect what Ronald Reagan rightly characterized as an evil empire, that he's not the good guy there. And that, I think, is this key. Like, just because the other side is doing bad things doesn't make Putin good.
Yes, I think the best way to sum it up is another quote from that article Jeremiah mentioned from Mr. Fleury. He wrote, quote, "The closer our president and our nation gets to Putin, the further it gets from what is good and what is right. The further it gets from God. That is deadly dangerous," end quote. And Mr. Fleury wrote that at a time when, there were like serious questions about the incoming Trump administration, what he was going to do with Russia. I think history has since proved that, you look at Trump killing Nord Stream 2, you look at him heavily arming Poland, like some of those initial fears were definitely like not coming to pass. But in principle, with people looking at Putin, say, as a savior defending Christianity or going to free the world from the deep state, when you paint somebody like Putin, who has done all these things we've mentioned, in that light, doesn't that normalize in people's minds like mass kidnapping of children or mass murder of people, or even just a desire to start conquering other countries? That is not healthy mentally or spiritually.
So, Jeremiah, we talked about Vladimir Putin's role in Bible prophecy this time last week, and that was the whole kind of first 10 minutes or so, really, of last week's show. But that is essential to understanding this subject, who he is, what is going on. So perhaps you could just give us a bit of an introduction to what the Bible says about the role that this man is playing in world events.
Sure, yeah. Well, there are several notable passages about an end-time multinational Asian confederacy that will soon be taking shape. And really, we already see this multinational Asian bloc coming together on the world scene today. But you can see passages in the books of Revelation and Daniel, Jeremiah, Joel. They all talk about how powerful this will be and how it will be one of the main belligerents in the final world war. And then when you go to the book of Ezekiel, especially chapters 38 and 39, it gives some very specific details about the leadership of this bloc. And if you look there in Ezekiel 38, 1 and 2, it shows that this will be a Russian individual who's at the helm of this. And Trumpet editor-in-chief Gerald Flurry has identified this individual as Vladimir Putin. So from that, we can be sure that he's going to be on the scene for some time. He's not going to be ousted from office anytime soon, and we should expect him to soon be leading far more powerful, military forces than he currently is in far more destructive wars.
And that underscored last week's show where we were asking, well, is he going to disappear from office? But those same passages do tell us about his character, what type of a leader he is, that he is going to be playing a pretty stubborn role, really, in fighting Jesus Christ himself. Like, you read those verses, and it really is incredible just how persistent, kind of hard-headed a leader that he is, that talks about him leading this army that's called the Kings of the East in the book of Revelation, that is there, ready as Jesus Christ returns. This army fights him. And you kind of put Ezekiel 38 and 39 in context with that, and they try it again. Once even there are peaceful people living peacefully in Israel again. After the return of Jesus Christ, he's still there, ready to go up and try and fight Israel. So this is not a good guy by any stretch of the world, any stretch of the imagination.
It's true. I think that the levels of determination that you can see in these passages about this Russian leader, and the defiance, just the sheer defiance. He's defeated once, and then he comes back after the world has had peace, and he says, I'm not happy with how things have taken shape here. I think that my people are not really getting a fair deal here. So he comes back once again after having been sorely defeated. So it is a pretty unusual, I think, outlook that we're dealing with in this man, and he's not someone who anyone should look to as a moral compass.
Thank you for that, Jeremiah and Mihailo. We'll take a short break, and when we get back, we'll look at the most important thing to remember about this prophesied Russian leader. Russian President Vladimir Putin, then, is a bad guy. When he talks about family values, when he talks about Christianity, it's all fake. Now, that could be a pretty negative message, but there's an incredibly positive aspect of this that we cannot lose sight of. And I want to just take a few minutes at the end of the show to look at a few scriptures that bring that out. And the first set of these are in Jeremiah chapter 17. Jeremiah chapter 17 and verse 1 begins by talking about Israel's sins just being deeply ingrained. It says, "The sin of Judah is written with a pen of iron, and with the point of a diamond. It is graven upon the table of the hearts and upon the horns of your altars." Again, something that seems like a pretty negative message. The sin of Judah is so deeply ingrained on their hearts, it's like it's written there with diamond tools. And this isn't just about Judah. This is the state of all of us, all mankind. Verse 5 says, "Thus says the Eternal, cursed be the man that trusts in man and makes flesh his arm, and whose heart departs from the Lord." If we're trusting in men, our hearts are automatically departing from God, and we are under a curse. Men are fundamentally flawed creatures. We can't look to men for hope. We cannot put our trust fundamentally in human leaders. But in his book on Jeremiah, Trumpet editor-in-chief Gerald Flurry writes, "This chapter in Jeremiah discusses hope." Why would he write that? with what looks like quite a negative beginning? Well, it's because this this chapter in Jeremiah shows us the causes of our problems and our solution. Let's look now at Jeremiah 17 and verse 7. And here it says, "Blessed is the man that trusts in the eternal, and whose hope the eternal is." If your hope is in some man to make the world a better place, God says you're under a curse. But if your hope is in God, well, that unlocks tremendous blessings. If we look at verse 8, it says, "For he shall be as a tree planted by the waters, that spreads out her roots by the river, and shall not see when heat comes. But her leaf shall be green, and shall not be careful in the year of drought, neither shall cease from yielding her fruit." So God says you're going to be blessed, and he doesn't say, well, there's going to be no hard times. I'm going to take away all adversity and troubles from your life. God doesn't promise that in verse 8. But he does say that when the drought comes, when the heat comes, when there are problems, you'll still be green. You'll still be growing and bringing forth fruit. You'll keep moving forward. You'll keep being blessed. And he uses that beautiful picture of a desert oasis to illustrate that. Mr. Flurry writes, "This is where mankind must begin. If we are to ever have hope, there is no hope in man. There is endless hope in God." That is the message of Jeremiah chapter 17. Verse 9 gets to the heart and core of there being no hope in man. It says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" That is the case of my heart, your heart, any human leader's heart. It is deceitful and desperately wicked. Who can know it? And Mr. Flurry writes, "Understanding this profound verse is more important than any education in this world. When we understand it, radical action is necessary. The greatest need is to understand God, to let him reveal our own sickness and heal it." That is our greatest need. So with all of that in mind, that this is our greatest need and where our only source of hope is, let's go back to Ezekiel 38. Ezekiel 38 and Ezekiel 39 are the two chapters that discuss this Prince of Rosh that we've just been talking about. And I want to draw attention to one real theme of these two chapters, a theme that is tightly interwoven with this Prince of Rosh. So if we start at the beginning of these verses, of chapter 38, "And the word of the Eternal came unto me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog, the land of Magog, and the chief prince," or really that should read, "the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal." When it says chief prince there, just like words like rob in English, it can be a verb to rob a bank, or it can be a name, and you have to use the context to understand which of those meanings it's referring to. Here it's the Rosh prince, the Prince of Rosh, and the King James English translators got a bit confused whether this was needing to be translated or whether it was a noun, a name. It's actually being used as a name, the Prince of Rosh, of Meshech, and of Tubal. And our free book, The Prophesied Prince of Rosh, goes over all of this in a lot more detail. But look at that verse 3. "Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, and the chief prince, or the Prince of Rosh, of Meshech and Tubal." So you have a human leader, and God says, "I am against you. I am against this man." Why would God allow a negative, all mankind is evil, but this is a particularly destructive man, one that God says, "I am against," who's responsible for a huge number of deaths. Why would God allow that guy to be in a leadership position, to rule over all of these people? Well, let's look at verse 16. It says, "And you shall come up against my people of Israel." So this is what we spoke about towards the end of the last segment. That God says he's going to turn this Prince of Rosh back when he returns to this earth. He is going to rescue Israel from captivity. That's the Jews in the Middle East, Britain and America. And they'll turn around, they'll obey God, they'll receive all of these blessings. And then the Prince of Rosh sees that and he's jealous. He decides he's going to go and grab him some of that wealth. And so it says, "You shall come up against my people of Israel as a cloud to cover the land. It shall be in the latter days. And I will bring you against my land, that the heathen may know me, when I shall be sanctified in you, O Gog, before their eyes." God says that he allows this to happen so that the heathen will know me. That is the context that the Prince of Rosh operates in. It is all about the whole world getting to know God. And look at how this is emphasized again and again and again in what you could call the Prince of Rosh chapters. I mean, look in verse 23. God says, "Thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am the Eternal." It's not about just Israel getting to know God, but many nations, nations that have never known God, all the world. I mean, we can keep looking in the next chapter, Ezekiel 39 and verse 6. "And I will send a fire on Magog and upon them that dwell carelessly in the isles, and they shall know that I am the Eternal." Verse 7, "So I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let them pollute my holy name any more. And the heathen shall know that I am the Eternal, the Holy One in Israel." They will know God. They will know where to find God, how to seek God. Verse 21, "I will set my glory among the heathen, and all the heathen shall see my judgment that I have executed, and my hand that I have laid upon them." Verse 23, "The heathen shall know that the house of Israel went into captivity for their iniquity." So they'll be taught about cause and effect. And they'll know, okay, well, Israel sinned. They disobeyed God. They went into captivity. They received curses. Now they're obeying God and they're receiving blessings. Again and again, God emphasizes that the heathen, that many nations will know God. This is about God teaching the Jeremiah 17 lesson to all nations. He's going to teach all nations about the evil of the human heart. He's going to teach all nations why Israel went into captivity, about the sin that was engraven upon their hearts in a pendant of iron. He's going to then teach them about their own sins, these heathen nations. And he's going to teach them about this same hope. He's going to teach them that there is no hope in man, that if you put your trust in a Vladimir Putin, it doesn't work out. He leads you on these incredible destructive attacks, but it's all part of him teaching them, well, this is how you flourish. This is how you produce fruit. This is how you have a joyful, abundant life. You put your hope in God, and God is going to teach that lesson to many nations, to the heathen. I mean, all around the world, there are pretty terrible leaders. Vladimir Putin is not the only evil leader. He's not the only prophesied evil leader, not by a long stretch. And God wants to help everyone not look to men. He wants to help everyone avoid the Jeremiah 17 curses. And he wants to help them all receive those Jeremiah 17 blessings. The presence of Vladimir Putin, this evil leader, is a sign of incredible hope. He is already a leader that God says will go up against Jesus Christ himself. He's a sign that Christ's return is near. And he's a part of God's plan to teach all the world about him. All the world about the way of life that brings blessings and avoids curses. So the fact that God has this leader there, well, it actually points us to God's love for the world. It points us to the fact that God has a plan that encompasses the entire world, that encompasses the nations of Israel, but then also the nations in Europe. It encompasses Russia and China and India. It encompasses Africa. It is about bringing the whole world to get to know God. That is what God's plan is all about. And we see that even from this individual, Vladimir Putin, the Prince of Rosh. Well, thank you so much for joining us on today's Trumpet World. Thanks to George Haddad and Isaac Lorenz for engineering and production. You can read and order all of the material that we've mentioned today on our website, thetrumpet.com. There's Jeremiah and the greatest vision in the Bible. Some of the material for this came from, I think it's chapter 8, No Hope in Man. From that booklet, The Prophesied Prince of Russia is just a little booklet that takes you and gives you more information about this crucial individual. So you can order that on our website. You can get in touch by leaving us a comment or by emailing us at trumpetworld@thetrumpet.com. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be back on Friday with our regular review of the news show. And until then, keep watching your world.